What if everything you were taught about following Jesus has been keeping you from the very transformation he came to offer? For 2,000 years, we've built magnificent cathedrals, composed elaborate liturgies, and created entire theological systems centered on worshipping Jesus as someone utterly different from ourselves, a divine being so far removed from our human experience that the best we can do is kneel in reverence and hope for mercy. But here's the startling truth that might completely revolutionize your spiritual journey. Nowhere in the Gospels did Jesus ever say, "Worship me." Instead, his actual message was far more radical, far more challenging, and infinitely more empowering. He said, "Become what I am." Has this ever happened to you? You've dedicated years to religious devotion, attended countless services, prayed earnestly, studied scripture diligently, yet somehow that deep sense of separation from the divine never quite dissolves. There's always this invisible wall between you and the sacred, between your ordinary human experience and the extraordinary consciousness that Jesus embodied. What if that wall was never real? What if it was constructed not by divine design, but by a fundamental misunderstanding of what Jesus was actually demonstrating? But before we begin, please hit the like button and let me know where in the world you're watching from today. It's always fascinating seeing who's joining us from around the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our future videos. Consider the most powerful statements Jesus made during his ministry. The kingdom of God is within you. You will do greater things than these. I and the Father are one. And then, remarkably, that they may be one as we are one. These aren't the words of someone establishing himself as uniquely divine while keeping others at a worshipful distance. These are the words of someone pointing toward a consciousness, an awareness, a way of being that he fully embodied and desperately wanted others to recognize in themselves. Jesus wasn't saying, "I'm special and you should worship my specialness." He was saying, "I've awakened to what we all truly are. Now wake up and join me in this recognition." The implications of this shift are staggering. For centuries, Christianity became a religion about Jesus rather than the religion of Jesus, the actual practice and consciousness he came to share. We made him the object of devotion instead of the example of transformation. We created rituals of worship instead of embracing the invitation to embody the same divine consciousness. And in doing so, we've kept millions of sincere seekers trapped in a cycle of external devotion that never quite delivers the inner transformation that was promised. Stay with me until the end of this exploration, because what you're about to discover might completely transform not just your understanding of Jesus' teachings, but your entire experience of what it means to be human. The revolutionary truth hidden in plain sight throughout the Gospels has the power to dissolve that sense of separation you've carried for so long and awaken you to a reality that Jesus himself lived and breathed. This isn't about adding another belief to your spiritual collection. This is about recognizing something so fundamental about your own nature that once seen, it changes absolutely everything about how you move through the world. So what truly changes when you grasp why Jesus never said, "Worship me," but instead invited you to become what he became? The persistent ache of spiritual separation that so many carry isn't a sign that you're doing something wrong or that you haven't tried hard enough. It's actually pointing to something far more profound, a fundamental misunderstanding embedded in how we've been taught to approach the divine. Think about it. You've attended services faithfully, perhaps for decades. You've prayed with genuine sincerity, studied sacred texts, participated in rituals designed to bring you closer to God. And yet, if you're honest with yourself, that sense of distance remains. God still feels like something out there, something you're perpetually reaching toward, but never quite touching. This isn't a personal failure. It's the inevitable result of a spiritual framework built on separation rather than recognition. The conventional path teaches you to worship an external savior, to seek divine intervention from outside yourself, to wait for grace to descend from distant heavens. And while this devotion is completely sincere, it actually reinforces the very gap it's trying to bridge. Every prayer directed outward, every act of worship focused on an external deity, subtly confirms the belief that you and the divine are fundamentally separate entities. The more you seek God out there, the more you confirm the assumption that God is not in here. What if the entire journey has been pointing in the wrong direction, not because the devotion is false, but because the underlying paradigm misses the essential revelation that Jesus was actually demonstrating? The transformation you're seeking doesn't require more intensity in your external practices. It requires a complete shift in understanding about what you already are. This is precisely what Joel Goldsmith discovered through his own profound spiritual journey. Goldsmith wasn't a casual spiritual dabbler. He had spent years immersed in religious study, following teachers, practicing various spiritual disciplines, genuinely seeking that connection with the divine that always seemed just beyond reach. He tried everything the conventional path offered, accumulating knowledge, refining techniques, dedicating himself to spiritual practices with disciplined intensity. But something essential remained elusive. That direct, lived experience of divine presence that transcends intellectual understanding. The breakthrough didn't come through more study or greater effort. It emerged in moments of complete inner stillness, when the constant chatter of the seeking mind finally quieted. In that silence, something extraordinary revealed itself, not as new information to be learned, but as a recognition of what had always been true. Goldsmith suddenly saw with absolute clarity that the Christ consciousness he'd been desperately seeking through external practices, teachers and techniques, had never been separate from him. Not for a single moment. It was his fundamental nature, the very essence of what he was beneath every thought, emotion, and temporary human experience. If this message resonated with you, hit that subscribe button to continue this journey of recognition together. I'd be honored to have you in this community. This wasn't a belief he adopted or a concept he intellectually accepted. It was a direct recognition that changed everything. About how he experienced himself and reality. The impact rippled through every dimension of his existence. Chronic physical conditions that hadn't responded to medical treatment simply dissolved. Financial struggles resolved without strategic manipulation, and an unshakable inner peace emerged that remained steady regardless of external circumstances. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic by exploring what this recognition actually means for your daily experience and why it transforms everything about how you relate to the challenges, relationships, and opportunities that define your human journey. The hidden truth behind Goldsmith's transformation wasn't that he finally found the right spiritual technique or discovered some secret practice. It was that he stopped looking outside himself for what was already present within. This shift from seeking to recognition is the doorway to the consciousness that Jesus embodied and invited others to share. If you've ever felt that persistent sense of separation despite sincere spiritual devotion, write in the comments, "I recognize this in myself." Here's where everything you've been taught gets turned on its head in the most liberating way possible. The Christ consciousness that religious tradition has positioned as something to worship from a distance, something that belonged exclusively to one man who walked the earth 2,000 years ago, that consciousness is actually the fundamental reality of what you are right. Now, in this very moment, not as a poetic metaphor, not as an inspirational concept to make you feel better about yourself, but as the literal truth of your essential nature beneath every passing thought, every fluctuating emotion, every temporary circumstance that seems to define your human experience. This is what Jesus was pointing to when he made those radical statements that religious institutions have spent centuries trying to soften or explain away. The kingdom of God is within you wasn't a comforting platitude about having divine potential somewhere deep inside that you might access someday if you pray hard enough. It was a direct statement about present reality, the consciousness he embodied, that awareness of unity with the divine, that unshakable peace, regardless of external storms, that ability to see through the illusion of separation. This was never his exclusive possession. It was his recognition of what we all share as our deepest identity. The entire trajectory of your spiritual journey shifts the moment you grasp this truth. You're not on a path of becoming something you're currently not. You're not accumulating spiritual merit through disciplined practices, hoping that eventually you'll achieve enough righteousness to earn God's approval or attain some elevated state of consciousness. That whole paradigm of spiritual achievement, of climbing a ladder toward distant divinity, collapses when you recognize what's already true. The divine presence isn't a destination you're traveling toward. It's the ground you've been standing on the entire time. This revelation completely transforms your relationship with spiritual practice itself. Instead of using meditation, prayer, or contemplation as techniques to eventually become enlightened, they become opportunities to clear away the mental noise that obscures your recognition of what already is. You're not trying to create or manufacture divine consciousness through effort. You're simply allowing the clouds of conditioned thinking to part so the sun that's always been shining can be seen clearly. The journey transforms from endless seeking and striving into recognition and allowing. Think about the implications of this mindset shift. Every moment you've spent feeling spiritually inadequate, comparing yourself to saints and mystics, believing you're somehow less than what Jesus embodied, all of that was based on a fundamental misunderstanding. Not of your limitations, but of your actual nature. The spiritual identity that Jesus recognized in himself exists prior to any temporary human experience you've ever had. It's what you were before any thought arose in your awareness, before any emotion colored your perception, before any circumstance seemed to define who you are. The hidden truth behind Jesus' teaching method becomes obvious when you see it from this perspective. He wasn't establishing himself as a unique divine being to be worshipped. He was demonstrating a consciousness that's available to anyone willing to recognize it. His miracles weren't proofs of his special status. They were natural expressions of living from this awareness of unity with divine source. And his invitation wasn't, "Worship me as different from you," but recognize what I've recognized, become what I've become, awaken to the consciousness we share. This shift from seeking to being, from achieving to recognizing, from future attainment to present reality, this is the doorway to the transformation that religious devotion alone could never quite deliver. The impact of this understanding doesn't just change how you think about spirituality. It reconfigures your entire experience of what it means to be human, what problems actually mean, and what's genuinely possible when you stop living from the illusion of separation. If this recognition is beginning to dawn in your awareness, write in the comments, "I am not separate." When this recognition moves from intellectual concept to lived experience, something genuinely miraculous begins happening in your daily life. And by miraculous, I don't mean supernatural events that defy natural law. I mean the natural unfolding of what becomes possible when you're no longer operating from a foundation of lack, fear, and separation. You start moving through your days from a place of inherent wholeness rather than constant grasping. That persistent background anxiety about whether you're enough, whether you have enough, whether you're doing enough. It begins dissolving not because you've convinced yourself everything is fine, but because you're anchored in an identity that exists prior to any circumstance. The challenges that used to define your entire emotional state no longer have that power. Not because you've become detached or stopped caring, but because you've discovered something within yourself that remains fundamentally unshaken regardless of what's happening in the external world. This is precisely what Jesus demonstrated throughout his ministry. Remember the stories that seem almost impossible to relate to. Jesus sleeping peacefully in the boat while waves crashed and his disciples panicked, certain they were about to drown. Jesus remaining centered and clear when facing hostile crowds, political pressure, even the prospect of execution. That wasn't superhuman detachment or divine specialness that you could never access. It was the natural expression of someone living from Christ consciousness rather than from reactive human personality. This quality of being is what Joel Goldsmith called divine indifference. And the term confuses people at first because it sounds cold, uncaring, even callous. But that's the exact opposite of what this actually describes. Divine indifference isn't about becoming emotionally numb or disconnecting from the human experience. It's about discovering a profound inner stability that allows you to engage with life fully without being destabilized by every shift in circumstances. Think of it like standing in the eye of a hurricane. There's chaos spinning all around, but where you stand, there's perfect stillness. You can witness the storm. You can even move through it when necessary, but you're not caught up in it, tossed around by every gust of wind. This is a radical departure from how most people experience life, where every external event creates internal turbulence. Financial problems trigger spirals of anxiety. Relationship conflicts generate days of emotional reactivity. Health challenges produce fear that colors everything. It's exhausting living at the mercy of circumstances, constantly buffeted by forces that seem beyond your control. But when you recognize your true identity as consciousness itself, rather than as the vulnerable human personality subject to countless external forces, a different possibility emerges. You discover that your essential nature has never actually been threatened by any temporary condition. The mindset. Transformation that occurs isn't about denying that challenges exist or pretending difficulties don't matter. It's about relating to them from an entirely different foundation. When you're rooted in the recognition of Christ consciousness as your actual identity, problems become something you're experiencing rather than something that defines who you are. That distinction might seem subtle, but its impact is revolutionary. You can address practical challenges with clarity and wisdom because you're not making decisions from panic, desperation, or the need to escape discomfort. You're responding from a place of inner stability that gives you access to genuine insight rather than reactive patterns. I create content exploring these transformative principles that can reconfigure how you experience life. If something shifted in your understanding today, subscribe so we can keep diving deeper. This is the hidden truth behind every story of Jesus remaining peaceful while others panicked, clear while others confused, centered while others scattered. He wasn't demonstrating that he was special in a way you could never be. He was showing what becomes naturally available when you recognize the consciousness that's your true identity. The same awareness that allowed him to sleep through the storm is present in you right now, beneath the surface agitation of worried thoughts and anxious emotions. If you've experienced glimpses of this unshakable inner peace, even for brief moments, write in the comments, "I know this stillness." The remarkable thing about Joel Goldsmith's awakening is that it wasn't just a beautiful spiritual experience that felt good, but changed nothing practical. The transformation produced tangible, measurable results in the physical world. Chronic health conditions that had resisted every medical intervention, conditions that doctors had told him he'd simply have to learn to live with, began dissolving naturally without any external treatment. Financial struggles that had created constant stress and limitation in his life started resolving through unexpected channels, opportunities appearing from directions he never could have strategically planned or manipulated into existence. These weren't supernatural miracles requiring divine intervention from outside himself. They were natural expressions of living from a different foundation altogether. When you know yourself as consciousness, rather than identifying primarily as a limited body-mind, subject to countless external forces, something fundamental shifts in how reality responds to you. This isn't about positive thinking or manifestation techniques where you try to use mental power to change circumstances. It's something far more profound. The limitations that seemed so solid and unchangeable were actually reflections of a limited identity. When that identity expands into recognition of what you truly are, the corresponding limitations naturally dissolve because they were never rooted in ultimate reality. They were expressions of a false understanding about your essential nature. This is where most spiritual teaching gets misunderstood and reduced to techniques you can add to your toolkit. People hear about these transformations and immediately want to know, what practice did Goldsmith use? What meditation technique? What affirmation or prayer formula? And that's exactly the wrong question, because it keeps you trapped in the paradigm of doing something to become something you're currently not. The revolution happening here isn't about adopting new spiritual beliefs or adding more practices to your already busy life. It's about recognizing what's already true beneath all the accumulated layers of conditioning, belief systems, and false identities. The awareness that's reading these words right now, that consciousness which observes your thoughts arising and passing, which notices sensations in your body and emotions flowing through your experience. This awareness itself is Christ consciousness expressing as your individual being, not a poetic metaphor, not inspirational language designed to make you feel spiritually significant. The literal truth of what you are prior to any thought, emotion, or circumstance. You don't need to create this consciousness through spiritual practice. You don't need to develop it through years of discipline. You don't need to attain it by reaching some elevated state. It's what you already are right now in this moment, regardless of whether you recognize it or not. Think of it like the sun hidden behind clouds. The clouds, your stream of worried thoughts, your identification with emotional states, your belief in limited identity, these can obscure the sun completely from your view. You might live for years feeling like the sun doesn't exist. That darkness is the fundamental reality. But the sun never stopped shining. It was always there, always present, simply waiting for the clouds to part so you could see what had been true all along. This recognition doesn't require years of spiritual achievement. It can happen in an instant when something within you becomes willing to look beyond the surface turbulence and see what's been present the entire journey. The impact of this shift extends into every corner of your lived experience. Decisions that used to create anxiety and endless mental debate begin flowing from a deeper wisdom. Relationships transform as you stop projecting your limited self-concept onto others and start seeing their essential nature too. The constant background fear about survival, security, and whether you're enough gradually dissolves as you discover an identity that was never actually threatened by any temporary condition. This is what Jesus meant when he said, "The truth will set you free," not belief in the right doctrines, but recognition of what's always been true about your fundamental nature. If you're beginning to sense this presence beneath your thinking mind, write in the comments, "I recognize what I am." So how do you actually live from this recognition in the midst of ordinary daily life? Because understanding something intellectually is very different from having it become your lived reality when you're stuck in traffic, dealing with difficult people, or facing challenges that trigger all your old patterns. This is where Joel Goldsmith offered something beautifully practical, what he called maintaining a listening attitude throughout your day. And before you think this means adding another spiritual discipline to your already overwhelming schedule, hear me out. This isn't about doing more. It's about bringing a different quality of awareness to what you're already doing. The listening attitude is simply maintaining a gentle, ongoing recognition of the divine presence within your own consciousness during whatever you're doing. In a business meeting, preparing dinner, having a difficult conversation, sitting in traffic, you can pause for just a breath and silently acknowledge the Christ that I am is present right now. You're not trying to feel anything special or achieve some elevated spiritual state. You're simply recognizing what's already true about your identity in this moment. This subtle practice gradually shifts your center of gravity from identifying with personality, circumstances, emotions, and thoughts to recognizing the changeless consciousness that witnesses all of these temporary experiences. The transformation this creates isn't dramatic or flashy. It's more like a quiet revolution happening behind the scenes of your daily life. Decisions start flowing from a deeper wisdom rather than from fear or conditioned reactions. Your responses to challenges become less reactive and more grounded in clarity. You discover yourself naturally acting from a place that feels aligned with something larger than your limited self-interest. This is what it means to become what Jesus was, not adopting his personality or mimicking his actions, but living from the same consciousness he embodied. Let me share a story that illustrates how profound this shift can be in practical terms. Sarah had suffered from debilitating anxiety disorder for 15 years. Not occasional nervousness or manageable stress. We're talking about anxiety so severe it often left her unable to function normally. She'd tried everything conventional medicine and alternative healing could offer. Multiple medications that either didn't work or created side effects worse than the anxiety itself. Years of cognitive behavioral therapy, breathing techniques, meditation apps, energy healing sessions. Thousands of dollars and hundreds of hours invested in trying to fix what felt fundamentally broken about her nervous system. When Sarah first encountered these teachings about Christ consciousness being her true identity, her reaction was dismissive. How could abstract spiritual concepts possibly help? With the very real, intensely physical symptoms that hijacked her body multiple times a day. Her anxiety wasn't theoretical, it was visceral, overwhelming, terrifying. But something in her, beneath the skepticism, recognized a truth in these words that went beyond intellectual argument. Rather than adding another technique to her arsenal of anxiety management strategies, she began practicing something radically different. During moments when anxiety was particularly intense, instead of fighting against the sensations or desperately trying to make them disappear, she would silently acknowledge, "This anxiety is something I'm experiencing, but it's not what I am." That simple recognition created space between her true self and the emotional weather passing through her experience. She wasn't denying the anxiety or pretending it wasn't happening. She was recognizing that these sensations and thoughts, however intense, weren't her fundamental identity. Within just a few weeks, something profound began shifting. The anxiety didn't magically vanish overnight, but her relationship to it changed so completely that the same feelings no longer had the power to control her life. She discovered a deep, unshakable peace underlying all surface emotions, like finding still waters beneath turbulent waves. If you struggle with anxiety or emotions that feel overwhelming, write in the comments, "I am not my feelings." This same principle applies across every area of human struggle, including situations that seem even more concrete and unchangeable than emotional patterns. Michael's story reveals another dimension of this truth. When his business collapsed and debts mounted to overwhelming proportions, he found himself at a genuine breaking point. Everything he'd worked for throughout his adult life was crumbling. The financial pressure wasn't just stressful, it was threatening to destroy his marriage, his home, his entire sense of security. And like many people who encounter spiritual teachings during crisis, his first impulse was to try using these principles as techniques to fix his situation. He approached Christ consciousness as a sophisticated manifestation method, essentially treating spiritual truth as a tool to attract money and manipulate circumstances in his favor. The real breakthrough came when Michael abandoned that entire approach. Instead of trying to use spiritual practices to change external conditions, he began living from the recognition of his spiritual identity as consciousness itself. Consciousness where infinite supply already exists as present reality, not as something he needed to attract from outside. Each morning, rather than visualizing money or affirming abundance as a future state, he would simply acknowledge the unlimited creative intelligence within his own being, regardless of what his bank account currently showed. This wasn't positive thinking or denial of his financial challenges. It was recognizing that his true source had never been external circumstances, clients, or economic conditions. His source was the infinite consciousness expressing as his individual awareness. What happened next illustrates the hidden truth behind how reality actually works. New opportunities began appearing through channels so unexpected he never could have planned or orchestrated them. Former clients he hadn't heard from in years suddenly contacted him with profitable projects. Investment possibilities surfaced through casual conversations that led to significant returns. But here's what matters most. The real transformation wasn't the improved financial circumstances. The genuine miracle was Michael's complete freedom from fear and worry about money. He no longer lived in that constant state of anxiety about security because he finally understood that his supply wasn't dependent on external factors he couldn't control. The source of everything he needed was the consciousness within him, which had never been separate from infinite creative intelligence. Margaret's journey takes this recognition into territory that most people would consider impossible. Physical healing that defied medical prognosis. After receiving a devastating cancer diagnosis with metastasis throughout her body, doctors gave her 6 months to live. She'd exhausted all conventional treatments without success. Chemotherapy and radiation had failed to slow the progression. In that place of absolute despair, when someone suggested that Christ consciousness was her true identity, her initial reaction was anger. How dare anyone offer empty spiritual platitudes during such a profound medical crisis? Yet in her darkest moment, something shifted, not through effort or desperate hope, but through a willingness to consider that there might be a truth about her identity that existed beyond any medical diagnosis or statistical probability. Margaret began spending time each day not praying desperately for healing or bargaining with God, but simply resting in quiet recognition of her spiritual wholeness, a wholeness that existed prior to any physical condition or diagnostic label. This wasn't denial of her medical situation or refusal of treatment. It was recognition of a deeper identity that remained whole regardless of what appeared to be happening in her physical form. As her consciousness gradually shifted from identifying primarily as person with cancer who might die, to recognizing herself as eternal spiritual consciousness, temporarily experiencing physical challenges, something profound began unfolding. The impact of this mindset transformation extended far beyond psychological comfort. If you've faced situations that seemed medically or financially impossible, write in the comments, "I'm more than my circumstances." Now here's where this recognition becomes truly revolutionary in how you navigate the world of relationships and human interaction. When you consistently live from the awareness that Christ, consciousness is your true identity, something remarkable happens with everyone you encounter. You naturally stop relating to people based on their personality quirks, their past behavior, their current mood, or their surface-level expressions. Instead, you begin maintaining an awareness of their spiritual identity beneath all the temporary masks they wear. This isn't something you have to force or practice artificially. It emerges naturally when you've recognized this truth about yourself, because you realize that what's true of you must be true of them too. This silent acknowledgement creates an atmosphere around you that people can feel even when they can't articulate what's different. Others begin naturally expressing their highest qualities in your presence, not because you're trying to change them, fix them, or convince them of anything, but because your recognition of what they truly are creates space for that truth to surface through their own awareness. You've stopped reinforcing their limited self-concepts through your reactions and judgments. You're seeing what they actually are beneath the conditioning, the wounds, the defensive patterns, and that vision itself has transformative power. Think about how this changes even the most challenging relationships in your life. That difficult family member who always triggers you, the colleague whose behavior drives you crazy, the person who wronged you in the past. When you maintain awareness of their divine nature, rather than constantly reacting to their personality patterns, the entire dynamic shifts. You're not denying that their behavior might be problematic or pretending that boundaries aren't necessary. You're simply recognizing something fundamental about them that they may have temporarily forgotten about themselves. This approach dissolves conflict in ways that confrontation and analysis never could, because you're addressing the situation from an entirely different level of reality. The cumulative impact of this recognition extends into every dimension of how you move through life. Your entire orientation shifts from struggle to flow, from endless achieving to simple allowing, from depending on human willpower to trusting divine guidance. Decisions that used to create anxiety and endless mental debate begin flowing from inner wisdom. That quiet knowing that emerges when you're connected to something deeper than conditioned thinking. Actions arise naturally from clarity, rather than from reaction to perceived threats or desperate grasping for desired outcomes. This is what it actually means to live by grace, a term that's been so overused in religious contexts that its original power has been diluted into meaninglessness. Living by grace isn't about being saved by believing the right doctrines. It's about allowing divine intelligence to guide your journey naturally, without the constant exhausting effort of trying to control everything through personal will. It's discovering that when you're aligned with your true identity, life begins flowing in ways that feel effortless compared to the struggle that characterized your previous existence. Opportunities appear. Solutions emerge, relationships heal, not because you're manifesting these things through techniques, but because you're finally allowing what's natural to unfold without the resistance of operating from false identity. This is precisely what Jesus was demonstrating through every aspect of his life and teaching. He wasn't showing you that he was special in a way you could never be. He was living as a fully awakened human being who had recognized his spiritual identity and was expressing divine consciousness in everyday human form. His invitation wasn't to worship him from a distance, but to become what he had become, to wake up to the same recognition, to live from the same consciousness, to discover that the kingdom of heaven isn't a place you go after death, but a reality available right now when you know who you truly are. If this way of living resonates with something deep within you, write in the comments, I choose to live by grace. If you've made it this far in our conversation, I want to acknowledge something significant. You're not here by accident. There's a reason this message found you at this particular moment in your journey. The recognition we've been exploring together isn't just interesting spiritual philosophy. It's pointing toward the deepest truth about what you are, and something within you already knows this. That's why you're still here, still listening, still allowing these words to resonate with whatever's awakening in your awareness. I create content like this every week, diving into these transformative principles that have the power to completely reconfigure how you experience life. If what we've explored today resonated with you, if something shifted in your understanding, I'd be honored to have you join this community of people who are waking up to their true nature. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss future explorations that continue building on what we've discovered together today. And here's how I'll know you made it all the way through. Write in the comments, "This message found me." When I see that, I'll know you received what was meant for you in this moment. Your comment also helps this video reach others who might be ready for this recognition, creating ripples that extend far beyond what we can see. If you found value in this perspective, leaving a like helps tremendously. It's a simple way of saying this matters and ensures that others who need to hear this will find their way here exactly when they're ready. There's a video right here that takes this understanding even deeper into practical application. It explores how to maintain this recognition when life gets chaotic and your old patterns try pulling you back into identification with limited self. Click and continue with me over there. I think you'll find it's the perfect next step on this journey we're taking together. The Christ consciousness that you are has always been complete. I'm simply grateful to walk alongside you as you remember what you've always known.